Olá, galera! Ai, ai. We are on air. Bem, pessoal, bem-vindos a mais uma live. Como sempre aqui, toda quarta-feira a gente está trazendo conteúdo novo, histórias novas, coisas épicas pra gente. E hoje eu estou muito feliz de trazer um amigo meu, um cara em que eu admiro bastante, bastante mesmo. Eu comecei na Pifen, ele foi a primeira pessoa, na verdade, a estar comigo no processo de onboarding, ele me ajudou no processo como um todo. E, cara, é um cara que eu admiro bastante, é um dos poucos MCMs da Microsoft, trabalha na área de dados hoje no time principal da Pifian, então é um prazer demais ter o Warner aqui, né, Matheus? Acho que a gente está muito empolgado para ver o que ele vai falar, né?
É isso aí, pessoal. A gente cada vez tentando trazer mais coisas para vocês e agora a gente tem aí um convidado especial, uma pessoa de fora, pessoas ficam perguntando como é que é o mercado de fora, muito para o Luan, muito para mim, então agora vão alguém que tem vivência que mora lá fora, que está vendo isso bem de perto junto com o Luan.
Perfeito, isso é importante falar. A gente está trazendo um cara com vivência fora, eu já vivo fora, mas ele trabalha, né, em alguns projetos muito mais high levels, então a ideia de trazer ele aqui é justamente para isso. Warner, can you just, first and foremost, thank you so much for joining the live. We are super pumped
Meus
and excited
amigos,
to have you.
beleza. I love it.
Can you introduce yourself again and just explain a little bit about your role and what you're doing?
For sure. So my name is Warner Chaves. I'm a principal consultant at Pythian. I have the pleasure of working with Luan every single day. And I've been at Pythian now for, it's a long time now. It's going to be 11, 12, 13 years. Yeah, it's a long time. 13 years working at Pythian, 15 working in just in general in the Microsoft data space. Especially over the last 6 years or so, though it has obviously exploded with the cloud and the first time that RDS came out in AWS, when Redshift came out, they were just big, huge game changers, right? And nowadays, we have RDS, Cloud SQL, Azure SQL Database, Redshift, BigQuery, Snowflake, Databricks, and the coolest kid on the block, Azure Synapse Analytics, right?
Let me just kick this off by asking you, do you really believe that, Synapses came out to change the world a little bit about how you just do data engineering?
I think, I don't know, have you guys have you looked at the latest updates that Google has done to the BigQuery UI? Do you think those are a coincidence? Have you checked it out? No? Suddenly BigQuery has like this tab interface that looks a lot nicer. Yeah. And they're going to add the capability to like source control your scripts and stuff like that, right? So yeah, why is that happening right now, right? The Synapse concept is great. The workspace concept is not going away. I think Microsoft really hit it out of the park with this idea. I think we're going to see the other providers copy the idea, right? That's the nice thing about the cloud. Everybody can copy each other. But right now, there is no other provider that is doing an integrated environment like the one we have at Synapse. There is no other integrated environment that has MPP, Spark, data flows, pipelines, and soon coming up, streaming as well, because we saw the announcement back at Ignite just last week about the integrated streaming too, right?
And that's funny because, 2 weeks ago, 1 week ago, we recorded a podcast talking about the possibility to have something about streaming, and then out of nowhere, that thing came out into Synapse, right? It was a coincidence. We didn't know about that, right?
No, yeah, we didn't know that it was going to come out at Ignite. And we said, you know what? The only thing that's really missing is some native streaming capability. So you don't have to do event hubs into storage and then into Synapse. And there you go. Microsoft was obviously listening to our podcast and and they rolled out the feature really, really quick the next week. Yeah.
Yes, before any further ado, if you would like to dig a little bit about the Synapse, the architecture, the goodies of the stuff, just feel free to kick that off.
For sure. So let me switch over to my screen. I want to give everybody we're going to do a tour. I'm going to set the stage first about, again, we just talked about the Synapse, why I think Synapse is a big deal. But let me set the stage. So can everybody see my screen now?
Yes, we can see your screen.
All right, so you should be seeing the Synapse workspace. But before we go into the Synapse workspace, I just want to show everybody two things that I think are important, and hopefully to motivate people as to why we should all be trying to learn. And especially if you already have familiarity with the Microsoft tools, then this is a no-brainer. This is an area that you have to get into. So this is a Morgan Stanley survey. It's very, very recent. It was just came out, I think, in January of this year. So it's tracking the increase in IT budget spending over the next 3 years amongst the large technology vendors, right? So the big ones like Google, Oracle, Microsoft, Amazon, et cetera, okay? And look at the survey, what it says here in terms of increase of spending, the top increase of spending. We have Google, Amazon, Microsoft. And you guys can see here, this is Amazon, even though it's, it has a bigger established cloud share. But the trend is that Microsoft is going to be growing more than Amazon, right? And then we have Google as a third player here as well, right? So number one thing is that if you are learning right now the cloud technologies, Microsoft is a good place to be. I would say either Amazon or Microsoft, they're both great places, great things to learn. Any of the top three are great to learn because there's always going to be, some demand for them. But look at how Microsoft is finally outpacing the growth of Amazon, right? So that's the number one thing I want everybody to keep in mind, right? So it's a good platform to learn, right? And then second is, let me see, I had another image here. This one. So this one is also same Morgan Stanley research that came out in January. It was a survey on CIOs asking them, what is your priority for spending for the next few years, right? So what are the most important things that CIOs, the chief information officers, the people that control the budgets of IT, they think that they want to spend? Okay, so let's look at the top 5. Digital transformation, cloud computing, and then, okay, security software, and not my field, collaboration, not my field. Number 5, data warehousing, BI, and analytics. Synapse covers all 3 of these here, right? We have digital transformation, all the data, everything that we can store, turn it into data, put it in the cloud, and then a full analytics platform right here. In the top 5 things that the CIOs think they're going to be spending on, we have Synapse covering, or is a piece of 3 of those top 5 things. And right under it is AI and machine learning. And nobody's doing AI and machine learning if they don't already have not doing analytics, right? So again, oh, and by the way, look at the priority for increasing data center spend is right here at the very bottom, right? Nobody wants to increase their data center footprint, guys. This at the top here, cloud computing, this is where we're all going, all right? So again, just to show everybody, this is a hot field. It's something that is going to be growing in the next few years. Is not going away anytime soon. It's great field of IT to invest your time, money, and career into, okay? And then I'm going to show you guys now, if you've never seen this, this is what Synapse looks like. And I'm just going to do really high level. I'm not going to go over every single thing in detail. And then I'm going to talk about a little bit more in detail about some of the fundamental pieces of Synapse. So if you look at the interface of Synapse, it's split here into data, develop, integrate, monitor, and manage. And I'm just going to do a quick rundown of what each one of these main 5 functionalities is about, okay? So first you go into data. Obviously, data is important. First thing is you can see, you can open this down into databases, and it's split. Oh, I got the tooltip there blocking my screen. There, and it's split into SQL and Spark, right? So right away, we see the integration of SQL Engine and Spark Engine. But not even just that. The SQL Engine itself is also split into 2 different engines, right? So you see this, they have little different icons, huh? So this one with that big house, that's the MPP engine. And this one with the database with that kind of like the power on off button, that's the serverless engine. This is also known as the dedicated pool or the serverless SQL pool. Okay, and there's fundamental differences there between the two of them, right? So let me go over here to my whiteboard and we can talk a little bit about that. So the dedicated, so we have the dedicated SQL. This, it was what used to be known as Azure SQL Data Warehouse, okay? And then now we also have another SQL engine, which is the Serverless SQL, okay? And they're not the same, okay? So the dedicated Azure SQL Data Warehouse engine, this is a provisioned, you create your MPP cluster, right? It has a bunch of different nodes. You can turn it on and off. And this in the background is split into a bunch of different SQL databases, right? And when you run a query, you got to distribute, the system distributes your data, and your data goes into a bunch of tables here in this data layer. This is stored in SSDs, and you pay per month on this storage, okay? The serverless SQL is different, right? This serverless SQL actually is an engine that you don't control. So I'm just going to make here a little cube. We're going to pretend this is a black box, okay? We don't really know what's inside here. You just send queries to this endpoint, and then from here, this connects to data lake storage, okay? So this is Azure Data Lake, all right? So that's number one fundamental difference. So we have two different SQL engines built into Synapse. One is the full MPP, right? Most massively parallel processing with multiple nodes. This can be up to 60 nodes. That's thousands, of course, when you get to that level of 60 nodes. So you can have the full MPP engine with full SSD storage, and this has the full T-SQL surface. It's almost 100%, not quite 100%, it's probably like 90% compatible with SQL Server, right? And then we have the serverless SQL that is completely managed. You just have an endpoint, you send queries to the endpoint, and it works only with Azure Data Lake, right? So this only works by taking from Azure Data Lake, it reads files, or it can read a folder, right? And then it does some crunching here, and then it turns you down, returns you the result, right? So first question people ask all the time, okay, so why do we need two different SQL engines inside Synapse? Okay, the reason for that is because they're not supposed to be equivalent. This engine here has full T-SQL support. It's MPP. It's got SSDs. This engine here is for enterprise, like enterprise BI. All right. So your enterprise dashboards, your enterprise reports, your subscription KPIs, all that stuff. This part is that's for, right? Serverless is for something else. Serverless is for exploration or for data engineering, right? Like you're transforming a file, you're just writing a SQL that's going to do one transformation over files. Then you want to use the serverless. Why? Because you just pay per query depending on how much data is read by the serverless engine. So it's very cheap. It's not always running. It works only with storage. You don't have to create a table to read from it. You can query it directly through an open row set command. And I'm not going to go into detail today on what that looks like, but Luan's going to talk later on the learning stuff that we're putting together. And we go obviously into detail on all of that, but just so that people are familiar with it, this is the reason why there's two engines inside Synapse that are SQL based, because one is for enterprise BI, the other one is for exploration or for data engineering, that you're just doing one-shot transformations, or you want to schedule just a SQL query to run over files and you don't want to have to manage a cluster just to do that, right? Because then you have to turn on the cluster, run your compute, turn it off. If you just want to transform, 5 files, it's a lot of work to bring up a cluster and just transform 5 files and then turn it off. You can just use now this new serverless SQL engine for that, okay?
Well,
And then,
let me
yeah,
just
go ahead.
stop you for a second. Yeah, first question of the night. So Hudson, it's just pretty much asking about what he sees that now that Microsoft released Synapse Analytics, they see like a lot of overlapping between Databricks and Synapse Analytics. He asking about your specific, take and 2 cents on what is your vision of the upcoming years of the future vision of Synapse Analytics and how they're gonna fight against Databricks.
Well, I think is if you are just adopting big data, you've never had any experience with big data. So this is the third engine that's not here. So we'll call this engine number 1, and then we'll answer the question at the same time. This is engine number 2. There's another engine number 3 inside Synapse, which is what I call vanilla Spark, right? Which is an Anaconda's distribution of open source Spark. So it's not just Spark, it's Spark with the Anaconda's distribution configuration. So it comes preloaded with like, I don't know, probably like a few hundred packages, right? Tons of packages come preloaded. And if you have another package that is not preloaded by Microsoft, there's a mechanism to load also custom packages, okay? So there are ways to get other packages into the Synapse Spark as well, right? But this is still, at the end of the day, this is open source vanilla Spark, right? So Databricks, I'm just going to write down here. Databricks is not open source Spark, right? Databricks is a closed source Spark. So if you've never done any warehousing, if you've never done any big data, and you're looking for, okay, I want to deploy an architecture that I don't have to worry about the components, how to configure them, how to integrate them, I would say just go with Synapse. That's the easiest thing you can do. The vanilla Spark works. It works well. Now, if you are a really experienced big data architect or big data engineer, and you like some of the goodies, what I call the goodies, I talk about this with Luana all the time, about the Databricks goodies. So Databricks has a bunch of goodies. What I call the goodies is basically the stuff that is closed source, that you can't get anywhere else, right? And some of the Databricks goodies, for example, are some different Spark algorithms to make it run faster. They have the new C++ SQL engine to make it go faster. They have nicer syntax for doing some things, like for example, for Delta tables. They have some functionality on Delta tables that is not available in the vanilla Spark. So if you've done your whole, requirements exercise and you think that you really need these things, well, then you can go with Databricks in that case, right? And then you just, whenever instead of using the Synapse Spark, just use Databricks. But keep in mind, Synapse Spark is just engine number 3, right? And then we still have 2 really powerful engines inside Synapse, and it's all sitting on Azure Data Lake. So what we've seen with some clients, and let me clear my screen here so we can keep doing our whiteboard. What I've seen with some clients is that they have Synapse, right? And this is all sitting on a foundation of Data Lake. So this is Data Lake. This is now turned into an architecture class, but that's okay. And what I'm seeing with some clients is if they are sophisticated, expert enough that they want Databricks, then what they do is, engines 1 and 2, the SQL engines, they use Synapse. And Databricks, well, guess what? Databricks has full compatibility with Data Lake too. And then they can use the Databricks Spark. And then that way you can have both if you want. And you can even have, a Databricks notebook that runs like a really big Spark job on the new Tungsten C++ engine, and then outputs the files right here into Data Lake. And guess what? You have, some analysts that really like to just use the serverless Synapse engine, right? and then they can just look at those files once they've been, let's say, pre-aggregated, or you run some ML scoring on them, or whatever it is that you're trying to do, right? So there's a way to mix and match them as well, right? So that's the cool part about this, is that Synapse itself, you can always mix and match with Databricks. If you want to switch out the Spark engine and you don't want to use the Synapse Spark engine, well, you can use the Databricks Spark engine and integrate them and communicate between both of them through the data lake layer, right? So that's the key piece, in my opinion. If you don't know why you would need Databricks, then you probably don't need Databricks, okay? So, right, it's like saying, like, you don't know how to drive and your first car is going to be a Ferrari, you're probably not going to get the most out of the car, right? But if you are really good expert big data architecture engineer and you've done the research and you really think you need the Databricks goodies, then this is an architecture that you can still use, that can still be very successful, right? By using Synapse SQL, Data Lake, and Databricks at the same time, right? So how it's going to develop over the years? Oh, well, it's very hard to have crystal balls, especially in technology. I don't expect Databricks is going to go away anytime soon. I think Databricks is doing a really, really good job on what they're building on top of Spark. Obviously, I don't think Synapse is going away anytime soon, because Microsoft is not going away anytime soon, and they have invested, billions of dollars into Azure, and Synapse is now the flagship analytics service. Maybe down the line, what we will start seeing is Microsoft, just how Databricks has developed their own Spark goodies. Maybe down the line, Microsoft will develop their own Synapse Spark goodies. That's possible. But I guess we'll just have to wait and see how it plays out. All right? Sounds good? Any other questions before we move on?
I couldn't put it better. Não, a gente não tem. Deixa eu só fazer um sumário aqui rapidinho. Just let me summarize here, just real quick. I was talking in Portuguese, sorry.
Go for it.
Pessoal, então a ideia foi exatamente te explicar a diferença de Synapse SQL com Databricks, enfim. Aproveitem para fazer perguntas. Matheus, você tem uma pergunta que você gostaria de fazer para o Warner agora? Sobre Synapse e Databricks, algo desse tipo, ou não ainda?
Não, ainda não, porque acho que ficou bem claro como ele
ficou bem claro.
Se você está num Advanced, você usa o Databricks. Se você está começando, Synapse. Então faz todo
sentido. Eu concordo 100%.
Também.
Okay, just go for it, Warner. Sorry.
All right, no worries. No worries. So this is, I hope it's really clear for everybody, the three different engines, right? So because a lot of what's happening now too is because Synapse is kind of like an umbrella service, right? It covers these three different things, and sometimes people just tell me like, "Oh, can I do X with Synapse?" And I'm saying, well, it depends. Which one are we talking about? Are we talking about Synapse dedicated SQL? Are we talking about Synapse serverless? Or are we talking about Synapse Spark, right? Because when people say like, oh, I did this with Synapse, it doesn't really tell me anything, right? It means like, okay, it's Synapse with which one, right? There's three different database engines inside Synapse, right? So it's better, we have to be clear about what we're working with. So that's cool. So like I said, you have the workspace here, and then the nice thing about this as well is that if you guys can see here, I can, navigate into the Spark tables, even though I don't have the Spark cluster running. I can look at the different tables I created on my Spark cluster. Look at all this different stuff I have here. And it's all integrated in one catalog. So that's something else that's really cool, right? So that's another part of the integration, is that, let me just use this here. Synapse also has an integrated catalog, okay? So there's a catalog here. And what happens with the catalog, let me get rid of this. We're not going to talk about Databricks anymore. All right. All right, so what happens with the catalog is that if you create a database, Spark database, and a Spark table, this gets entered into a catalog in the Synapse workspace. Okay, so there's a row here now that says, oh, there's a Spark database and a Spark table. And the cool thing about this is that you can actually access these through the other engines. Okay, so that's really neat. Right, so you can query those Spark tables from the other engines without having to do any configuration. It's pre-integrated for you. So that's really, really cool, because then, you don't have to do a lot of work to bring the Spark data into this, SQL context. So if you have, again, your analyst, if you have your analyst and he's, writing queries, he wants to access Spark, you don't even have to give him access directly to a Spark cluster. You can just say, oh, you only want to use Spark tables? Great. I'll give you permissions into the serverless engine, and then the serverless engine will go in and give him pass-through access there to the Spark table. So it's fully integrated that way as well, which is really, really cool. The other thing also is that Synapse itself opens up to the rest of Azure. Even things that are not inside Synapse properly, you can add them as, you see this here at the top where it says linked. So you can link different services that have data into your Synapse workspace as well. So you can see here, for example, in my Synapse workspace, there's an Azure Blob storage that I already set up as a link service. There's a Cosmos DB I set up. There's an Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2 that I set up. These integration data sets is like data sources that you can set up to use in the Synapse pipelines. You can see I have a bunch already there. But so it's really cool that even if it's a service that doesn't live directly inside Synapse, like the SQL pools or the Spark pools, you can always configure them to bring their data into Synapse if you want to. And some of them do really cool stuff. Like, for example, here, you guys can see here, I have these, let me see if I have this up and running. Yeah, it is. Okay, cool. So you guys see, for example, I have this Cosmos DB one, right? And I have this trending artists collection inside Cosmos DB. Now, if you're not familiar with Cosmos DB is Azure's NoSQL database, right? And the cool thing about this is that Microsoft created, let me go back to my whiteboard, and I'll show you guys real quick an idea here. So Microsoft created this thing. So I have this thing called Cosmos DB, right? Cosmos DB, I'll have my Cosmos DB database. And this is, writing documents. And then Microsoft created this thing called the Synapse Link, okay? And then what the Synapse Link does is that as you do operations in your Cosmos DB database, it transforms this data into a columnar format, okay? And stores it into a storage location known as the analytical store, okay? You don't have control over this. It's totally managed. So you don't have to set it up. You don't have to worry about it, nothing. And then from the analytical store, using that Synapse link, you can actually access it from either the Synapse SQL engine or the Spark engine. Both of these have access to this analytical store. So that's really, really cool, because then what happens here is that this Synapse link has a 5-minute lag, right? So you can do near real-time analytics with the Cosmos DB and the Synapse link, right? With a very, very, very simple architecture. You just have to deploy a Cosmos DB collection, and Cosmos DB is NoSQL, right? It doesn't enforce a schema. So for example, if you want to use it to do something like, let's say like gaming or IoT, or what could be another good scenario? Maybe like web app profiles or stuff like that. All this, and if you enable the analytical store, in 5 minutes, it gets replicated into this analytical store that Synapse can read and write. And then once it's in Synapse, for example, we could, put in front of Synapse Power BI, right? And then you're going to have like, a chart on Power BI trending something. Maybe, your sales or whatever, right? So you have Cosmos DB as a NoSQL database for operations. then using this analytical store, which is basically a checkbox, boop, on the Azure portal, and then you have a 5-minute near real-time replication to be able to do analytics over that data with zero development, zero code, no code, complete solution for near real-time analytics, right? So that's really, really cool.
Warner, just
Yep.
Felipe Santos just asking like a quick question regarding the catalog. Is the catalog a kind of metadata inside of Synapse Analytics?
Yeah, it's a metadata layer inside Synapse, exactly. So you don't have to do anything. You don't have to enable it. It's just there. Whenever you create a Spark table, it creates a record in that internal catalog, and then if you try to access it from the serverless SQL engine, then it just basically works. You just have to use a special nomenclature. You have to use the 4-part name, the name of the Spark database, and then .dbo, even though there's no DBO in Spark, that's just the way they made it, and then the name of the table, and then it will pull up the Spark table for you. So there's nothing you can do about it. Yeah.
As the same as we have Databricks goodies, that one for me specifically it's a Synapse goodies. Like having this whole integration in the catalog is just super dope.
Yeah, it's definitely a Synapse goodie. I agree, right? Because this is also one of the main drivers of Synapse, right? Like if we go back and look at all this, is that everything is fully integrated, right? So for example, I want to navigate this a data lake storage account, right? So I can look at the contents of the data lake storage account. I can do lots of things here, right? I can upload, I can download, I can look at new folders, I can browse the data, right? I don't have to leave the Synapse workspace to do something with the data. And then I have a bunch of different options too. Like if you right click on it, then the options, they're all very friendly towards helping you do something with the files, right? So you can see a new SQL script, a new notebook, a new data flow, new integration data set. It's like, okay, what do you want to do with this file? Let me help you do something with it, right? And you can see all of them have different options to what to do with them. So really quick, really fast, you're basically up and running, right? So I say, oh, wait, let me see this file, user artists, augmented artists, info, parquet. How do I look at this? Oh, I'm just going to click here, select top 100. I don't know what's inside this parquet file. Oh, here it is. I already just did it in like 3 seconds. Now I know what's inside this parquet file, and I can have it in a nice grid. And, I can export the results. I can turn them into a chart if I wanted to, if I want to do just a quick visualization, right? So it's a very powerful GUI, right? Like you can really easily get going and do stuff when you're exploring, right? Like I mentioned before, the serverless SQL pool is really for exploration. And you guys can see here, this is what I was talking about before. Again, I'm not going to go in details on this right now, but you see this open row set function just allows you to pull from the data lake storage. You guys will see here, basically providing a data lake storage address, and it's a parquet file. And then I can just do regular select statements. It's just the from has been turned so that it kind of like creates like a virtual table over the parquet files, right? And there's tons of capabilities of what you can do with this. I'm just going to go real quick just to give people an idea of everything you can do with it.
On the meantime, Jose it's asking about Synapse Link. It's like Data Factory linked server.
It's like a linked server, but it's a linked server that automatically transforms your format of data to one that is built for analytics, right? Because like I mentioned here, you have the Cosmos DB documents, and then behind the scenes, Microsoft is transforming them into columnar storage that will perform well with analytics, right? It's not just, oh, here's the Synapse storage. Let's say this is, this represents the Synapse storage. So we just created this Synapse link that's a link server between Synapse all the way to your Cosmos DB storage, wherever that's sitting in an Azure data center. That's not what it is, right? Because that's how a link server works in like the SQL Server space, right? Whereas Synapse Link, it connects into the analytical storage. And this analytical storage is being maintained in near real time by Microsoft to convert from this, Cosmos DB format into a format that is optimized for analytics, right? So it's a similar concept for sure, but the transformation here from regular storage to analytical storage is what makes it be, useful for analytics. Otherwise, it would be super slow.
Felipe Ferreira.
I don't like that guy.
He's calling us slackers. Okay.
Yeah.
Murilo Miranda, it's calling us as master slackers. And I have a real question now. Yeah, that's true. So Rodrigo is asking, how does the Synapse handle with PYY data? Is there any next, finish, or checkbox configuration for this?
For what?
PYY. It's just P2 data. So just secure data.
Well, that depends what your requirements are. If we're talking about like masking or stuff like that.
Yes. I think that we have something similar on the data governance side, right? On Purview. Then
but Purview is like a totally different product, right? Purview is its own thing. For everybody that's not familiar with it, Microsoft, actually, I think there's a screen dedicated to Purview now. Let me go show you guys right now.
Yeah, I did the integration today.
Here. There it is. So for all of you that are not familiar with it, this is Purview. So Purview allows you to do data registration, data discovery. So basically, it will build a catalog of all your data sources and the fields and everything. So the data governance piece right now, Microsoft is trying to implement it through Purview, and it's integrating Synapse with Purview, right? So it's not literally inside Synapse. What you're doing is that you can hook up your Synapse workspace or account into your Purview account and then visualize your artifacts on Purview from a data governance perspective, right? So that allows you to have like, tag on fields or identify if you have some PII, be able to build a dictionary for your data sources, search on like, different semantics of the data sources, et cetera, right? So this is inside Purview. If we're talking about some of the other stuff, like just, I want to know about the security, how should I handle PII if I'm working on Synapse, then the key for me in that space is that the SQL tool, right? The SQL pool, sorry. If you remember what I mentioned before, I said, engine number one is the SQL MPP full engine, the one that has like almost full T-SQL compatibility. And this engine, you can do masking, right? This engine, you can do encryption, right? In this engine, you have all the SQL Server built-in role-based access control, right? So to me, if you have any sort of sensitive data, what you should try to do is to just have it all in the SQL MPP engine, because it's the one that offers the most features in terms of how to handle secure data, right? If you were trying to do the same thing with something like Spark, for example, then you basically have to develop it on your own, right? You have to research some masking library in Spark, some encryption library in Spark, then you have to write your own Python code or Scala or whatever it is that you like to write in Spark, and roll out your own code to do those things. Whereas in the MPP SQL dedicated pool, all those things are already there for you to use, right? So in my opinion, that's the recommendation I give people is if you have some sensitive data, then the best place to put it is not necessarily in the data lake, is to just put it inside tables in the MPP SQL dedicated pool. Sounds good?
That tackled the question for sure.
All right, so let's go back here. I'll show you guys something else as well, is to keep in mind that Synapse also has full integration with pipelines, right? So if you need to create any sort of pipelines that do any work on data, then you don't have to leave Synapse either, right? So for you guys that are familiar with Azure Data Factory, this is probably familiar with you as well, right? Right now I'm looking at a data flow. So Synapse, what Microsoft has done is they basically took the Data Factory engine and they've put it inside Synapse as well. And it's integrated with your Synapse data sources so that you can easily import them, output from them in your data flows, right? Or in just general using the pipeline editor, right? So all the activities that are in Azure Data Factory, they're available as well here if you want to add them to Synapse. You can see here, for example, you got all the different activities: move, transform, the Azure Data Explorer, functions, batch, even Databricks. You have all the different activities to handle the orchestration of the data flow, right? If you want to do variables, if you want to execute another children pipeline, all that stuff that's in Data Factory is available inside the Synapse pipelines as well. And also the data flows experience is also available inside the Synapse environment as well. Now, some people always say like, well, why would I want to use data flows if all these things that you're doing here in this data flow, like, joining to different sources, see if they match, do something if they're not matched. Well, you could technically code all of them in a notebook or in a Spark job. It's up to you, right? It's just basically different tools for different people, right? If you like developing in a graphic environment and you don't want to write Python or Scala or Java to do this exact same things in a notebook or a Spark job, well, then you have data flows as an option for you, right? So it's not something as like everything has to be done exactly the same way, right? Like, you have some freedom as to, what tool you want to use. Do you want to use data flows? Do you want to use a notebook? Do you want to write some SQL on the serverless pool, right? You have to use your creativity as well. See which one you like the most, and then you can adopt that one, right? It's up to you.
Yes, Warner, I have like an interesting question, so that's why I'm just popping up here. So Ed Willie is just pretty much asking about one of the common problems by doing data processing at scale. So he's just pretty much asking your vision about if you have any recommendation or best practices regarding processing large files, either on Spark or any other engine. So is there any good practice for that, like processing 5 gig, 10 gig file size? So how we handle that in the processing zone?
Well, I mean, it depends what you're trying to do with the files, right? If there's a way that you can split them, if it's a really big file, 5
Yep.
gigs or 10 gigs is actually not that particularly big. You can probably get away with a small Spark cluster to process something like that if you wanted to. It depends what you're trying to do with the file, right? Usually a good way to, or something that's good to do with when you have only one big file, you can read it through Spark, then you can redistribute it on Spark. Spark has the capability to redistribute it after you redistribute it, right? Because what happens usually with really big files is that you end up with one node grabbed a bunch of the buffers for the file, and then maybe another Spark node that has like a few. So the data is not distributed evenly throughout the Spark cluster, right? So then when you're trying to do other operations, one of the nodes in the cluster is doing a ton of the work, and then the other ones are idle. And you never want to have that in a parallel system, right? In a parallel system, you always want to have all the nodes doing something at the same time, right? So that's how you really get performance. So redistributing is a common practice as well. Something that a lot of people don't do a lot or the people assume in Spark is that they think Spark is kind of like SQL Server, especially if they're coming from an Oracle or SQL Server background. They think that Spark kind of has like a buffer cache, like SQL Server, right? Or like Oracle does. They don't realize that Spark doesn't really cache anything unless you ask it to cache it, right? Databricks is another Databricks goodie. Databricks actually has a buffer cache that you can use if you're using Delta tables. But vanilla Spark doesn't, right? So you have to say, look, explicitly in the code say, okay, data frame dot cache, and make sure that it's cached. So the next time that you use that data frame, you don't have to go back into storage, right? If you don't cache it and you just rerun it again, it's just going to go back into storage. It's going to go back into reading it again. And it's just going to be, you're going to be paying for that price over and over again. So those are a couple. I mean, like I said, it really depends on what you're trying to do, but a couple of techniques for sure is to redistribute the data and to make sure that you are caching the data if you are actually going to be using it multiple times, right? So if that's the case, you definitely want to be explicit about it and cache it. Not there's no automatic buffer cache in Spark, for example, right? So that's something to keep in mind as well.
Just one question, about, and this is my personal question about the data flow itself. It's the same, is the engine of Data Factory. Today we see the Synapse Analytics is a new product. I think it's version 2, right? It's the second version of Synapse. And do you see that this engine is the same as engines like the single, like if I go to Data Factory, I have the same things I have on Synapse Analytics using Data Flow, for example. I have the same integration, the same items I need to use to pump off the data of someone else. What do you talk? It's the same. Is it exactly the same engine?
Yeah, it is the same engine, but there might be a few. But I've noticed, or what I've been noticing the last few months, is that they're bringing out stuff first on Data Factory. So sources or capabilities, they're coming out on Data Factory, and then they show up after a few days in Synapse. But the underlying engine is definitely the same. I mean, even if you look at, to show you guys right here, for example, integration runtimes, right? So if you're familiar with Data Factory, you're probably familiar with this concept of integration runtimes, right? Which is basically is the engine of Data Factory, right? And you can see here inside Synapse, we get an auto-resolved integration runtime, basically the cloud integration runtime. And I have this other integration runtime here because in my training, I show people how you can connect to on-prem. I don't do it to on-prem, obviously. I just use an Azure virtual network. And you can have the same thing, right? It's self-hosted integration runtime. It's the exact same bits from Data Factory as well. So the engine itself, for sure, is the same one under the covers. But some of the functionality that shows up in the graphical interface is I've seen that it comes up first stuff on Data Factory, and then we're gonna see it on Synapse, right? And the idea is not for both of them to diverge. Like, I really don't think that's what Microsoft wants. I think Microsoft is intentional about this. They want Data Factory, and then Synapse catches up, Data Factory, and then Synapse catches up, so that we don't want them to diverge, right? Because then what happens is if they start to diverge, then it's a problem for people, right? It's like, oh, I can't take now my Data Factory packages into Synapse, or I can't take my Synapse packages into Data Factory, right? And that's it's silly. Why would you want to fragment the market in those ways inside your own ecosystem, right? It doesn't make sense. If you don't use Data Factory at all and you're going to adopt, or you're thinking of adopting Synapse, I would say to just forget about Data Factory. Just do everything in Synapse pipelines. It's basically the same thing. You might not get like the latest and greatest things right away, but what does it really matter? Like, if you're going to adopt it today, it's okay. If you're already using Data Factory and you already have a bunch of stuff in Data Factory, you can adopt Synapse and just not use the pipelines inside Synapse. It's up to you. I mean, there's a lot of value inside the product. You have the other 3 engines. You can just switch out to Data Factory. But if you've never touched Data Factory and you're starting from scratch, there's no point in having Data Factory and also Synapse. Then just do everything inside Synapse, right?
Warner, question. Rodrigo is asking about, can Synapse connect with Delta architecture? For example, if you would like to read a Delta Go table, would you be able to make that inside of Synapse workspace?
So that's a really good question, and you can read Delta on Vanilla Spark as long as it's a version of Delta that is at or below the version of the open source Delta Lake, right? Because inside Synapse, what we have is the open source implementation of Delta. Okay, so if you create, like if I go right now and create a Databricks Delta on the latest version of Databricks, and I try to then open that same folder inside Synapse, it's not going to work because it's not going to have the same metadata format anymore because it's a newer version, right? I'm using the newest Databricks version of the Delta Lake. The other way it does work, so if I create a Delta Lake table on the open source Delta on Synapse, and then I try to open it in Databricks, that works because Databricks is further ahead, right? It's kind of like, can I attach a SQL Server 2008 database into SQL 2012? Yeah, you can, right? Because SQL 2012 is backwards compatible, but I can't attach a SQL Server 2012 database into a SQL 2008 one, right? So it's the exact same concept. So you can interact in both ways with a Delta table, as long as you're doing it with a newer version, right? If you're doing it with a backwards version, then it's not going to work. So that's why for most people, if you start developing in Databricks, then that Delta table is not going to be compatible with Synapse until the open source Delta table catches up to the Synapse version, right?
I don't see this documented anywhere. So how do you know that? I mean,
Oh, I
you
know
just kind
that
of skip over, but
because actually in one of the Databricks seminars, people asked about the backwards compatibility of Delta tables, and the guys from Databricks mentioned that the way that because and it wasn't related to Synapse actually, they were just asking about compatibility between Vanilla Spark and Databricks Spark, and what the Databricks guys said is that it's forward compatible, but it's not backwards compatible, right? So you could have, like I said, you could get the version of Synapse because it's older than Databricks. You can open it in Databricks, but the version of Databricks, because it's newer, you can't open it in Synapse. Right? But keep in mind, right? I mean, if you have like a gold table and you created it with the latest version of Delta and you're using Databricks, then just use it with Databricks, right? Like I mentioned before, like you don't have to, like, you can use both services for their strengths, right? You don't have to like try to fit, a circle into a square shape, right? If the strength, you wanted to have the latest version of Delta table, to use the latest version of the Tungsten engine with Databricks, so then use Databricks. It's okay, right? There's not a big deal. But keep in mind, because Databricks has that integration with Azure Data Lake, maybe you have an architecture like this. You have your gold Delta table on Databricks, but you have like maybe a daily summary or an aggregated summary or like a weekly or monthly report that you also want to share through the SQL database endpoint so that people can just use it easily with like Excel or an OLAP tool or something like that. And then you just have a notebook scheduled on Databricks that, every Friday, it reads from the gold table on Delta, and then it outputs the pre-aggregated results as vanilla Parquet files, right? And then those vanilla Parquet files, you read them without problems from either the Synapse Spark or the SQL Serverless or even the SQL dedicated pool using Polybase, right?
that's a good recommendation, tip, and best practice. Spot on, Warner.
All right. And then the other thing I wanted to show you as well, for those that are not familiar with it, so I just showed you the, this is what is known as a mapping data flow. Well, Microsoft kind of changed the terminology. Now it's just calling it data flows. And then there's the other thing called a wrangling data flow. I'm just going to show you one right here. I hope it doesn't crash my browser. I'm going to warn you guys right now. If you see here, the Power Query, the wrangling data flows, is in preview. So, here we go. Let's see what happens. I like to live. I like to live dangerously, so I do this in live recordings. preview features in live recordings. Oh, let me hide this. All right, so it did work. Cool. So for all of you that are familiar with Power BI Desktop or with Power Query inside Excel, then this is nothing new for you, right? This is exactly what you've seen before, is the Power Query engine inside the Synapse workspace. If you, on the other hand, are not familiar with Power Query at all, then basically what this is another way to transform data that is graphical, and it takes a step-by-step approach, right? So if you see here, let me move this over. You see here, I did several transformations here on this particular data source, right? So I inserted a conditional column, I replaced a couple of values, and then I reordered the columns. I moved one column from one position to the other, all to arrive here into this result, right? So if I went back here, let's hope this will work. There we go. So if you see here on this, at the very initial step of the transformation, I created this conditional column to just basically say, if you are over 65, then you are going to get labeled as a senior. If you are less than 18, you get labeled as a minor. And otherwise, you're just going to be labeled as an adult. You can see here, I have adult. I have a couple of minors, blah, 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 all the way down, right? So this is a transformation. And then you just go step by step transforming your data until you have what you want. You can see at the very last step, which was to reorder the columns, my age range was the last column because I just added it. And then in the last step, now the age range shows up right next to the age because I wanted them to just show up right next to each other, right? So this is Power Query. Now, again, people ask, okay, but then, there's like a million ways to do, to peel this orange. How am I supposed to decide which way I want to do something? It's up to you. Adding a label like this and reordering the columns would have been really easy on Spark. I mean, I could have done it with like a few lines of Python as well. Some people have an easier time visualizing the progress and the transformation if they can do it in a visual way, right? So they rather do this than write some Python. That's fine. Do this then. Some other people will say, well, but also you can also achieve the same thing using the mapping data flows as well. And yeah, everything you can do in a data flow, you can also do it in the Power Query and vice versa. But they have different focuses, right? Just by looking at it, you can tell, right? If the idea of your transformation is more to integrate different data sources and not so much as transform individual sources, then the mapping data flow makes more sense, right? As you can see here, the focus is in the flow, right? It's in the steps. I'm looking here at the main canvas of the mapping data flow, and I don't see any data. What I see are the sources and the steps that we take to integrate them. If I go to the main canvas of the Power Query or wrangling data flow, what I see is the data itself, right? I'm not seeing the flow. What I see is the data itself and the steps of transformation to be able to get the data to where I wanted it to be, right? So that's the difference, in my opinion, is if your focus is on the flow and integration, then you can use the data flow. If your focus is on transforming the individual parts or fields of a source, then wrangling data flow is good for that if you want a graphical experience. If you hate GUIs, then just, write some Python, write some Scala, write some Java, and put it all in a notebook or in a Spark job. And then you don't have to deal with graphical interfaces at all, right? So there's something for everybody, I would say. And that's the whole point of the Synapse experience, right? It's to give everybody a bunch of different ways to do things, but always in the same environment, always really tightly integrated. Okay.
So it's just, in a nutshell, is bringing all the tribes in one place, right?
Mm-hmm. and you have the choice. How do you want to do something, right? You can do notebooks, you can do SQL scripts, you can do pipelines, you can do data flows, and it's up to you. We talked about this in the podcast. What is a good data engineer? A good data engineer is a good coder that is creative in how they work with data, right?
Well put it. Yeah, I agree. I totally agree with that
All
statement.
right, I think we're coming up on the hour now, so yeah, I guess we can just wrap it
Yeah,
up
you hit
here.
the 1 hour. You told me that we didn't go further than 45 minutes.
It's all
So
right.
I
Yeah,
just made it. No, it's
it's all
okay.
good.
It's okay. We have plenty of time to that. Ok, let me just switch to português. Pessoal, eu queria que vocês utilizassem, assim, é um cara único, digo para vocês, trabalho com ele há muitos anos e, cara, o jeito que ele explica, a forma que ele faz é única, digo isso de coração mesmo, mas queria saber se vocês tiverem alguma pergunta antes da gente falar mais algumas coisas, seria legal. Vou deixar aqui mais uns minutinhos enquanto eu pergunto algumas coisas para ele, mas usem agora esse momento para perguntar, tirem suas dúvidas. Okay, let's go to the questions, right? We have some of them. So Rodrigo is asking about how does the orchestration of jobs works inside of Synapse? Can you integrate with Airflow somehow, or I mean, they're
With
just
what?
animals with Airflow. Is there any way
Oh,
to?
with Airflow. Yeah, I guess so. I mean, I'm not super familiar with Airflow, but as long as you can trigger either a like a store procedure, for example, or if you could trigger run a Python script against to trigger a Spark job or something like that. I mean, there must be a way, because there are endpoints, right? There's external endpoints for Synapse, right?
Yeah,
So it's not like everything in Synapse just lives inside Synapse, right? I can, for example, I can go into Excel and connect to my Synapse SQL if I wanted to, right? And then I could just trigger whatever, like, you know, and obviously you're not going to trigger something from Excel, but if Airflow can connect to the SQL MPP engine, then
yes.
it can do whatever. You can run a
Yeah.
store proc, you can run a SQL script, right? You can do pretty much anything you want. The only thing that is not available right now is that the Spark engine does not have an external endpoint, okay?
Yeah.
So if you wanted to, let's say, do like a transformation through Spark and then somehow orchestrate it through Airflow, then that would not be something that you would be able to do. What you would have to do is that piece, you have to like schedule it with Synapse itself through a pipeline, right? So you create a pipeline, the pipeline executes a notebook, and then through Airflow, you just have to go in and check whether the file is ready or not, or something like that, right? Because it's a pure Spark operation. If you're doing something with the SQL engines, then both SQL engines offer external endpoints, and you'll be able to just connect directly and do something to it, right?
Yep. And something, I mean, nice to note is that, I mean, if you just want to execute queries on the serverless, you can just connect in the application as usual as like Azure database
Azure
and
SQL DB, yeah.
just throw queries, right? And that's going to do
It
the job.
doesn't know that it's talking to like the serverless engine. It thinks it's just talking to an Azure SQL database. Yeah.
Yeah, I tested today. Okay, I don't think we have any more questions. Okay, we do have actually, yeah, we got like 2 things. So can I upload a CSV file to Azure storage and transform it using Power Query inside of Synapse?
Yeah, for sure.
Yep. Yeah.
This is what I'm doing here, actually. I think this is a file. Let me see. Oh no, this is a SQL. This is a SQL on demand external table. So it's probably a file somewhere. But yeah, you can. I mean, I've done it before as well. You can define the different sources, and then you can use the Power Query on them. Same as how you define, you know, like if you do it with Power BI desktop, right? So, yeah,
a good question about CI/CD and DevOps. So does Synapse deploy well with Azure DevOps? So is there an integration that deploys everything using Azure DevOps?
So I will tell you, I haven't used with Azure DevOps, but I can. It is, by the way, it is compatible with Azure DevOps. But right now, if you guys can see my workspace, it's integrated with GitHub. right? So I'll show you right now here. So you'll see if I had I have multiple branches on my environment, so I can use that to develop and then merge back into my main branch. I can also create pull requests directly from Synapse if I wanted to merge. If I want to, disconnect this source control integration, then you have this option here, switch to live mode. And live mode basically means no source control. It's just whatever the last version of the script is, then that's what's saved on the Synapse data lake storage. So Microsoft just basically stores your scripts and that's it. But there's no actual source control in it. There's no branch, no merging, right? It's just scripts. But when you set it up from scratch, you have the option of choosing whether to do GitHub or the Azure DevOps repos, right? So you do have that integration.
Yeah, Leandro is asking because while just deploying Data Factory using, DevOps, there are some gimmicks. But yeah, just to reply on that, yes, it's totally feasible to deploy Synapse using DevOps. I already tested that.
I know it's that for sure. There's the option, because when I set up mine with GitHub, they gave me the option of, are you integrating with GitHub or with Azure DevOps repos? So I know for sure you can do it. I just, I only use GitHub, to be honest.
Yeah, Rodrigo has an important question. So what about costs? Because whenever you're just trying to compare between Databricks and Synapse,
well, everything depends on what you're trying to do, right? So serverless, you pay, I think it's $5 per terabyte processed, right? So $5 per terabyte that you process. And there's the capability to do cost control limits, right? So you can have a serverless, you can set up a daily limit, weekly limit, monthly limit, right? So that's how serverless works. SQL DW is provision resources, and it depends on the size of your nodes here. Where do I get the price? One sec. Oh, let me just try to create a new one. There we go. So here's loading the estimated cost. Let's give it a second here. So you can see here, if I just do development, then I don't really need a DW1000, right? So I'm just going to bring it back down to DW100. This is the initial level, lowest level. It actually is one node, so it's not really parallel. But it's good for dev tests, so functional testing, right, or development. And that's it's 154 Canadian dollars an hour, which is about something like 1 to 115 US dollar per hour. For real production use, what I find is that most people will start at something maybe like a DW300, so that gives you 3 nodes, so that's pretty nice. And that will go into 461 Canadian an hour, so that's probably like 3 point something US per hour. Now, if you're using 24/7 data warehouse, then you can do the math. That's probably around a couple of grand a month, multiplied by 12, 24,000 US a month, per year. Sorry. If you compare that to the price of enterprise warehouses on-prem, is ridiculous.
Bananas.
If you compare it to the price of other warehouses in the cloud, it's really hard to compare. You have to look at the same. All the other variables have to be the same, right? Are you using the same amount of cores? Are you using it for the 720 hours that are in an average month? There's a lot of different things to consider if you're looking at all the comparisons, right? If you're going to compare with Databricks, you can compare with the price of the Spark pools, which is also different, right? Here's the loading estimated cost. Right, so for example, here I have a Spark pool that has auto scale, and it can go from 3 to 10 nodes. So it gives me an estimated cost from 471 to 15 per hour. So it depends, how much are you going to use those nodes or not. The Spark pools can auto pause as well, so maybe it won't be on all the time. So it's not the easiest thing to compare with some of the other products, unless you're doing like the exact same thing on both of them, right? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I do have a question. So it's pretty hard to explain to the customer regarding the difference between the serverless and the dedicated pool. So have you ever seen this problem just going through other customers too? So, like they trying to understand the difference between them?
Yeah, I do what I did with you guys. My previous explanation, right? I just draw down. This is the the one for enterprise is dedicated. The one for exploration or ad hoc, meaning whenever you want. Data engineering. This is the serverless, right?
Perfect.
And the last difference is this only works with data lake. This is full T-SQL with tabular T-SQL storage, right? SSDs, right? But again, this SSDs, tabular data lake for if it's not like somebody that's really sophisticated IT person, they're not gonna care about this either. But you can say enterprise reporting, dedicated exploration or ad hoc, serverless, and that's it.
Good. I think we are running out of time, but let me see if we have any other question. Nope, we don't. So Warner, before we finish, I mean, we're just eager to announce that you're just coming in Brazil, not in Brazil, but virtually in Brazil.
I wish, because it's
Yeah,
really
you
cold
wish.
here right now, man.
Yeah, to teach a Synapse course. So can you just enlighten us a little bit about what you're gonna tackle, what
Yeah,
you're gonna
absolutely.
cover,
So
and
this
just
is so the course is practical data engineering with Synapse Analytics. So it's not just we're going to learn Synapse Analytics, but there's also a big focus on the practical data engineering part, right? So for example, the first day we're going to go through like the fundamentals of all these. I'll go into more detail about the differences between the engines and stuff like that, but the fundamentals of Synapse. But also I want to share with people, and I share with people some of the tools that I use if I have to do like a data engineering or warehousing project, some of the process, how I follow the process of how I get these projects going. So it's not just about how to do Synapse, it's also about how do I do data engineering, right? And hopefully that's valuable for people as well, so they can get some value out of my experience out of doing those things and out of working with a bunch of different tools and stuff like that, right? So that's something that is important to consider, right? It's not just Synapse, it's also about data engineering in general, right? um, and that's pretty much day one. Then we're going to talk about in the next it's 5 days. We're going to do 3 hours per day. We're going to look at the dedicated pool in detail. So we're going to look at all the different ways that you can distribute data in the MPP pool. How do you handle column store data in the MPP pool? A little bit of how do you get the execution plans, look at the execution plans, which are different, right? We're talking about the distributed execution plans. They're not like the SQL Server execution plans. We're going to talk about partitioning, for example, if you want to do partitioning on the MPP engine, how it's different as well. Then we're going to look at the serverless engine, and we're going to do a ton of examples on the serverless engine into how you transform data with the serverless engine. I'm just going to show you guys a sneak peek here. Let me forget about this wrangling data flow. So let me show you guys here my on-demand script, so you guys can see here. This is just all the
That's just
examples. How
one.
about you can do that? Yeah, this is just one. I have, you guys can see here, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different scripts of examples. But this is every single different format, how we can deal with Parquet, how we can deal with JSON, how we can deal with CSV files, how you can do partitioning with open row set, with folders. All that stuff is here. So we covered that serverless engine in detail with all, and obviously everybody that joins the training, I'll give you everybody the download package so you keep all the scripts as well. So we do that deep dive into the serverless engine. How do you do everything in the serverless engine? And then we also do a deep dive on Spark as well. I'll show you guys as well. if you are not, and this is the best part about Synapse, Synapse is great for learning Spark. Okay, if you've never used Spark, you can join the training, and I guarantee you, you won't be a Spark guru by the end of the training, but you will be dangerous. Okay, that's my promise. My promise is that you'll be dangerous. Yeah, and we do everything in Spark, because we go all the way from just creating a database to how do you process the files, how do you load JSON data, XML data, you know, views, temp tables in Spark, partitioning on Spark. How do you do partition elimination in Spark, analyzing your partitions in Spark. As long as you are familiar with databases, that's all you need to know. And if you're not familiar with Python, the code is extremely simple. I walk through the whole thing. You know, I don't assume that the people joining the training are Python experts. If you're a Python expert, then you're not really going to get a lot of value out of the Python itself. You're just going to learn how to use Spark inside Synapse. And if you are not a Python expert, you don't need to be a Python expert. This is actually a great way to just be introduced into Spark. Okay, so it's not necessary to be a Spark guru or no Spark at all. If you've never learned Spark and you want to just find a way to get introduced to it, I think Synapse is great, and the material assumes that you don't know Spark. So that's the third pillar, right? The third engine. And then finally, the last engine is obviously the pipelines. You guys can see here, there's 10 different pipelines already I pre-created to cover pretty much everything that you can do inside Synapse, right? We have pipelines that get triggered when you add a file. This is a mapping data flow pipeline. This is a mapping data flow pipeline that can do schema drift. Some anti-patterns, things not to do with mapping data flows as well. How to execute a Spark notebook through a pipeline with a parameter, using wrangling data flows, using delta copies, using the serverless engine. So if you only want to bring in, you know, the records that are older than a particular timestamp, all this stuff is as well here. We want to walk through the pipeline step by step. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff, guys. Sometimes I worry that 15 hours is not even going to be enough. But, you know, I'll do my best. It's really, really something that I'm really passionate about, is that people walk out feeling like they got a lot of value out of spending 15 hours with me.
Wow. Where is the link of the registration? So how can I buy? Because I want this course desperately. Okay,
Right.
so Warner, let me explain how the mechanics is going to work for them in Portuguese, okay? So
Yeah, go for it.
Just go in, yeah. Então, pessoal, a gente, cara, foi assim, o Matheus está de prova, vou até adicionar o Paulo aqui agora, que vai estar com a gente, para explicar o quão foi difícil para trazer o Warner para cá, para a Onway. Então a gente conseguiu fazer um treinamento com um cara que, sabe, é espetacular, sem sacanagem. Ele cobra esse treinamento um valor de dólar aproximadamente entre $1.000 a $2.000 por treinamento, e claro que isso é um valor completamente normal lá fora do país. Então uma das coisas que a gente conversou com ele é, cara, como a gente conseguiria fazer essa transição de processo lá, né? Pra gente, como o treinamento, como vocês estão vendo, o treinamento vai ser feito em inglês, eu acho que o inglês dele é extremamente claro, muito bom, numa velocidade ótima. Porém, quem vai estar de mentor lá no treinamento vai ser eu, então eu vou estar acompanhando tudo. Então, se vocês tiverem questões, se vocês tiverem dúvidas durante o treinamento, se vocês quiserem escutar eu explicar alguma coisa, enfim, então eu vou estar lá traduzindo isso para vocês, caso vocês tenham alguma dificuldade, tá? E, além disso, no final do treinamento a gente vai ter algumas outras oportunidades. Então, eu vou deixar agora o Paulo explicar um pouquinho como vai ser essa dinâmica, qual é o preço, enfim, tudo isso para vocês, tá? Então, deixa aí a galera.
Boa noite, pessoal. Todo mundo me ouvindo aí, tudo ok?
Tô te ouvindo bem,
Bom,
tô te ouvindo bem. Uhum.
Então, boa noite a todos. Bom, como o Luan falou, esse tipo de conteúdo aqui, a gente está trazendo aqui para a comunidade de engenharia de dados, né? como eu falei, como ele já tinha falado, e como a gente já tem disseminado alguns conteúdos aqui, alguns alunos já fez alguns treinamentos antes aqui com o Luan, e é isso que a gente tem foco, é poder trazer o diferente, né? A gente não quer trazer o que todo mundo está falando, a gente quer trazer uma experiência nova, e como o Luan falou, é conseguir trazer o Warner para cá, é uma coisa assim que agrega muito a comunidade. Então eu acho que para quem está na área, então, consome esses conteúdos, e principalmente também consome conteúdos em inglês, realmente isso vai ser um passo gigante aqui para a nossa comunidade. Acho que vai quebrar uma barreira enorme para poder estar, né, disseminando esse tipo de conteúdo, esse tipo de conhecimento. Bom, como a gente tinha falado, eu tinha combinado com o Luan, né, a gente estava com treinamento aqui do Warner, ele já tinha conversado com ele, tem, como é que se diz? Tem essa amizade com ele há muito tempo, então conseguiu trazer para a gente. E nós temos... Calma aí, deixa eu só ver se consigo compartilhar aqui.
Compartilha a tela que eu coloco aqui para você.
Tá,
Tá, pessoal? E assim, lembrando também que Synapse é um produto extremamente novo, e não só isso, o cara vai ensinar Spark também, tá? Então vocês vão ver tudo do que vocês precisam saber para realmente, cara, ser um master ali dentro do Synapse. Vê se você consegue compartilhar a sua tela aí, Paulo.
Vê se você consegue ver.
Ah, apareceu aqui, cara. Apareceu.
Então, pessoal, esse treinamento, ele ia custar R$3.100, que foi um valor que a gente tinha chegado, tinha conversado, né? Porque realmente, cara, olha esse nível de treinamento, esse nível de conhecimento que vai ser passado, né? Então, e fora a experiência que você vai ter de estar tendo, para quem já foi aluno dos outros treinamentos, sabe como que é importante esse contato durante os 5 dias, como que é importante você tá perguntando na hora, porque a gente sabe que, às vezes, quando a gente compra um treinamento gravado, tem aquele lance da gente assistir a hora que a gente quer, a gente pode procrastinar. Então, assim, com esse treinamento você vai estar ali, ao vivo, perguntando, fora que se você tiver alguma dificuldade com o idioma, o Luan vai estar lá. Então, assim, cara, olha o nível que vai ser esse treinamento. Então, assim, o primeiro lote que a gente vai ter, ele vai ser R$2.297. Então, ele já está disponível lá no site do Simpla, a gente vai jogar o link aí. Só que, para quem ficou até agora, e é isso que a gente fala toda vez nas mentorias que a gente faz, é isso que a gente dá valor. É exatamente essas pessoas que estão consumindo, estão correndo atrás, estão buscando algo novo na profissão. Então, a gente sempre dá esse desconto nas mentorias. Quem já participa já sabe disso, né? Então, a gente sempre, no dia da mentoria, a gente tem um desconto. Luan, eu mandei o link aí para você que eu te mandei no WhatsApp. Manda o link com esse desconto. E quem quiser conversar, trocar uma ideia a mais aqui agora até a meia-noite, que é o que vale esse cupom aí, pode entrar lá no grupo, mandar uma mensagem direta, tirar mais dúvidas, ver o conteúdo que vai ser passado, tá bom? E é isso, é essa informação que a gente tem para vocês, é essa oportunidade.
Boa. Paulo, agradecer também por isso, né? Porque foi um trabalho em conjunto aqui, nós três estamos trabalhando bastante para conseguir fazer isso.
Uhum.
Eu pessoalmente, assim, falando, é um prazer enorme ter o Warner, de verdade, cara, assim, fazendo um treinamento aqui pela Unway, assim, tipo, é absurdo, porque há 6 anos atrás esse era o cara em que eu não conseguia falar inglês, e, cara, ele foi o cara que me recepcionou na PIF, e hoje ele tá aqui fazendo um treinamento, e, cara, eu posso falar para vocês com toda a expertise que eu tenho da minha vida, assim, se vocês me conhecem, eu posso garantir, dar o stamp milhões de vezes que, cara, esse cara, ele é um monstro quando ele fala, assim, acho que vocês conseguiram ver em 1 hora, um treinamento com ele de 15 horas, cara, é um privilégio ferrado, assim, eu já tive treinamento com ele, por isso que eu falo, quando a gente teve essa abertura de trazer esse cara para cá, velho, vale demais, não somente pelo treinamento, mas, de novo, pelos insights do cara. Sobre as questões do dia a dia, dos cases realmente de clientes gigantescos que a gente já trabalhou junto e de clientes que ele já trabalhou fora, assim. Então, o que você suga de conhecimento nesse tempo, cara, eu juro para você, é muito precioso. Então, até a gente da Onway tá animado, né, Matheus? Tipo, o que você tá sentindo? A equipe da Onway, a gente tem vários funcionários hoje e tá todo mundo pegando, caramba, eu vou entrar, eu vou ter, enfim, né?
E para completar, Para completar, é isso que a gente está falando. Esse foi o intuito de quando a gente começou, e toda vez eu reforço isso, quando a gente começou lá atrás conversando, e você falou, olha, eu tenho essa vontade, de disseminar esse conteúdo, esse tipo de conhecimento, exatamente para chegar nesse ponto. Chegar no ponto de a gente conseguir quebrar essa barreira entre países, né, entre a língua, e trazer esse tipo de experiência. Então, às vezes, para quem já está na área, para quem já está como profissional, é muito bom ter esse tipo de experiência. E para quem está iniciando agora, conseguir enxergar aonde ele pode chegar, onde ele pode alcançar dentro da profissão, né? E reforçando também a parte do treinamento, o conteúdo ele vai ser ao vivo, né? Então, tipo assim, as aulas serão ao vivo. E no final, como todo treinamento que a gente tem aqui, a gente vai entregar as gravações para você estar revisando depois, para poder estar olhando com calma, porque a gente sabe que 15 horas é um conteúdo muito denso para você consumir tudo de uma vez. Então, você vai estudar, vai tirar suas dúvidas, e ao final do treinamento você vai receber a gravação para você estar revisando e tá olhando o conteúdo durante o ano, né, Luan?
Durante o ano. Então, assim, outra coisa que a gente, né, conseguiu trazer no modelo OneWay é fazer com que essa gravação fique um ano disponível para vocês. Então, assim, cara, sendo bem sincero, acho que não tem nem o que falar, assim, sabe? Tipo, é uma oportunidade única mesmo, de verdade. Assim como a gente teve o Edwin Sarmiento há 2 anos e meio, 3 anos atrás aqui em Brasília, a gente está tendo esse cara aqui agora online para poder falar. Então, assim, eu estou muito animado. E detalhe, essas vagas são 20 vagas só, né, Paulo? São limitadas, né? Hoje,
Isso,
né?
são 20 vagas para hoje, para quem ficou na mentoria até hoje. E por isso é importante também você entrar no grupo, qualquer coisa, você conversa com a gente. Você tem até meia-noite para conversar, a gente vai estar aqui dando suporte e esclarecendo as dúvidas. Entendeu? Então, mas é importante a gente ouvir vocês. Pode dar sua opinião, pode entrar lá, tirar as dúvidas.
Sim, e o Rodrigo está perguntando se ele vai conseguir acompanhar com subscription free. Consegue. Então, se você fizer o spin-up de uma subscription free, você consegue durante o mês, com certeza, tranquilamente, rodar o treinamento inteiro durante a semana. Tá tão bom o deal que vou fazer na BR pagar em CAD. Boa. Olha o Felipe, né? Essa é boa. Porque, cara, o Felipe, por exemplo, o Felipe que trabalha lá em CAD.
We're doing a special rate for Felipe, so he gets the full Canadian rate. Yeah. Come on.
Yeah. Who are these
No, we're gonna say we are not like, like in YouTube, sometimes it's like this content is not licensed for your area, and we don't do that here. Wherever you are, it's okay, Felipe. You can join. It's fine. We're not gonna put a black screen if you try to join from Canada. It's okay.
Who are the slackers right now? Just kidding. Ok, eu vou lançar o treinamento agora, eu vou lançar o link. Então, esse é o link do treinamento, tá? Tá aberto para vocês. Deixei bem fácil aí, bit.ly, AWS Synapse. Então, né, corram e façam suas inscrições, que, cara, a gente da OneWay tá super animado. Imagina para quem vai ter o privilégio de fazer esse treinamento. Bem, acho que é basicamente isso que a gente tem para apresentar. Eu vou deixar aqui por alguns minutos aberto, e se vocês tiverem alguma pergunta, alguma coisa, Warner, I would like to thank you so much for having you not only here, but in the training, so I'm super excited, pumped, flabbergasted. I don't know what to say.
And for people that don't know this, I ran this training for DPS, the company that runs DPS in India. I ran this training for DPS back in December. It was 8 hours because DPS said pre-cons have to be 8 hours. So I ran 8 hours for DPS. I had 20 people on my DPS pre-con. The one that got the most got 25. So I was apparently the third pre-con to get the most people. And I got all the feedback and all the questions that I got from DPS. I created this is the V2 of the training, okay? DPS was the V1. Synapse was in GA at that point. I created 8 hours of material. With the feedback from DPS, I created this new version. Is the V2 version of the training. It's almost double the size, right? I went from 8 hours to 15 hours of material. Synapse is now generally available. We at Pythian, we're actually, Luan, myself, we're already working with Synapse now. That is GA as well. So this is not, just to say that this is the improved version of the training as well. So I took all the feedback from DPS. I'm bringing it here. I spoke to Luan. I said, hey, you guys have a great community in Brazil. I have the new version of the Synapse training. Let's do it. Let's make something happen. So yeah, I'm really, really excited about it.
Yes. So deixa eu compartilhar um novo aqui, pessoal.
Solta o link do grupo também, se alguém quiser tirar alguma dúvida lá dentro.
Isso aqui, ó. Eu acho que agora vai funcionar. bit.ly. Agora vai, galera. Acho que esse link funciona. Warner, that's it. We just opened up. So let's see how that plays out. And I'm super excited, just waiting for the course. And that's just pretty much that.
Yeah, we had an awesome group at DPS. I'm sure we're going to have an awesome group here as well. The people that, I always tell people, if, the work, the market, everything is like, it's like a bell curve, right? On one side, on the extreme side, you have the people that haven't learned anything since 1989, and they're still just managing SQL 2005. And then on the average, the vast majority of people are somewhere in between. And then on the other edge, you have the people that are constantly learning, the people that spend money to stay at the edge. Those are the people that get paid at the end of the day. Right? So if you want to be at that edge, you want to be the outlier that is in on the latest, the greatest of what is happening in the industry today, then, if you think that this is worth your time, like to me, it's obviously, it's an honor to be able to, spend 15 hours with a group of people that just want to really learn some of this really cool technology.
Yes, before we sign off, deixa eu pegar essa do Marcelo Kamimura. O treinamento vai ser totalmente online, Kamimura, gravado, ele vai ser feito no GoToTraining, tá? Então vocês vão ter acesso a uma sala privada, a gente vai fazer a gravação do treinamento como um todo, voz, vídeo, tudo, e esse material vai ser disponibilizado para você após isso. São 15 horas de treinamento, de 7 às 10 da noite, como a gente sempre faz aqui na Unway, beleza? Pessoal, obrigado, galera. And yeah, I'm backing out. Thank you so much, Warner. And
good night, everybody, as well.
Appreciate
everybody else taking the time after, probably most of you, just like us, were working today. You still took the time, showed up. That's all, You could have been doing anything, watching some Netflix instead, but you're here. That means a lot as well.
Yeah. Thank you, guys. See you. Bye-bye. Tchau, pessoal. Até mais. Prazer.
Tchau.
Tchau.